Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and with me today are Mark McCaffrey, Mark DeSantis, Lindsay Powell, and Murray Dahm, who's the assistant editor and the one you hear every week on the Ancient Warfare Answers podcast. And we have an in-betweener, as we call him today, where we thought we'd talk about some of the biggest, I'm not sure myths, but one of those established ideas and see what we can come up with and how these things might work and what the evidence is. And the one we decided upon was the triplex Achaeus, the quincunx formation. And perhaps to start us off, Mark suggested we should look at where does it come from? And then we can see where does it go. Mark, the origins.
That's because you said we were going to throw the other bark under the bus.
I know.
This is
exactly.
Revenge. Yeah, absolutely.
Revenge, yeah, I know. Where do we start? Typically, if you open your average book on Roman armor and weaponry and tactics, there is some reference to the Romans starting out as with origins going back to Greek hoplite formations. But actually, if you look at it a little bit more in depth, actually probably the original weaponry and tactics is going to take a lot more from the Etruscans, possibly. And that's where you get a lot of their early weaponry, which is actually more native to Italy, developing things like early examples of the scutum being developed along lines of the Etruscans, who are influential. But as it goes towards the 7th and 6th centuries, you start to get more of the influence coming from the Greeks. And so therefore you get in the literature and in the artwork, you get more of the idea that there are ideas of hoplite warfare, hoplite equipment coming across into Italy. How much that actually percolates down into the actual army of early Rome is very debatable, because of course what we're seeing in our artwork, what we're hearing about in the literature, might actually only be pertaining to the aristocratic leadership. And so subsequently what you might be getting is and again, this also debate in terms of what exactly is the army made up of in those early stages. And you're probably more realistically looking at something like a war band, which is being led by an aristocratic leader. We've, of course, got that wonderful reference to the Romans starting out their history under a regnal period. Traditionally, they talk about 7 kings, starting with Romulus, going down to Tarquinius Superbus. But actually, when you look at it more carefully, the idea of kingship doesn't quite fit the bill in terms of what the Romans mean by rex. And so subsequently, you're probably looking at something more like, as I say, a warband leader. And so subsequently, in terms of the army that he's leading, it's probably more a clan-based army, such as we see with the famous Fabii army that happens in the 5th century. 5th century. And subsequently, the armor is probably, hence what I said before, you might get some Greek armor being worn by the leaders of those clan-based armies, but actually the majority are probably very light on in their actual armor as such. You get lots of references to pectorals being used as the main bit of metal armor. They probably had a lot of linen or material armor like you see from the Greeks as well, but there's no evidence for that because it hasn't survived in terms of the archaeological evidence, and also in terms of the art and literature that focuses mainly on the aristocratic element. So this idea of the Romans have originally a hoplite style armor that then develops is a little bit shaky. How that develops into what we see later on, because of course then we have our main sources which are very much based in the later period of the Republic, the only exception to that being Polybius, but most of our sources are probably a little bit off in what they think of as the early Roman style. Polybius is different, and that's where we get this idea of a Manipul Army somehow developing, but how that develops is not entirely clear. Whether it's a development from those early clan-based armies. And again, those clan-based armies probably fought, if we look at the weaponry that does come out of archaeology, there's a lot of evidence for spearheads indicating the type of equipment that's going to suggest a large, solid formation. So, as akin to the hoplite phalanx, maybe, but then why that would break up into a manipular army where you've got the three main ranks, I'm not including the Veletaser, but additionally, the different formations is not entirely clear.
And there's lots of solutions that have been suggested for this. I mean, we've always had a lot of historians arguing why in Greece, of all places, which is not exactly known for being flat, you would come up with an army that really needs flat, open space to have a phalanx in. And the same goes for much of Italy, really. I think Jeremy Armstrong suggested actually that the manipular army might come from that clan-based army, in that you get, an army that is made up of individual clans, and they follow the commands of their clan leader, and therefore operate a little more loosely, which might actually work in the broken terrain, than a full phalanx.
And you don't get in Italy the same, we'll always fight in Boeotia, because Boeotia is the dancing floor of war. We'll have multiple battles with Mantinea, because if you're in the Peloponnese, the only place you can really fight a phalanx battle is in Mantinea. We don't get that in Italy. There's not the everybody assemble at Cannae and we'll fight Cannae 1, Cannae 2, Cannae 3, Cannae 4. So in a way, there's that lack of respective history of we fight battles in this place because this is the only place we can fight battles.
Lack of ritualized warfare is
that was
really
the word I was
talking about
for.
In terms of, rather than meet on the established locations, it is much more a moving scenario, and that's possibly where you get in terms of the Manipular army, the fact that it can be, if you look at the design of it in terms of those three main elements of the Manipular army, there is then the reference to it actually moving as three columns on the march, and then being very, very flexible when it comes to actually deploying when it needs to. Maybe that's indicating that that it's not so ritualized, that it is more needing to react to the scenarios it comes across.
I was under the impression during the Republic that the legionaries were picked by lot, right? They would go to the Campus Martius, and there would be a drawing by a lot. So if it's a clan base, that breaks down, because it's centuria. It's the voting centuries of the Roman male population assemble, and they are picked at random, so that the next campaign season it may be a totally different group of people.
I think you're dealing with what happens later.
Well, this is what I'm trying to work out. I mean, at what point does
when you have the clans and they've all come together to fight as clans, they fight as clans. Later, when you have them as centuriata, they are selected by lot from the wealth category clan. So not all of them serve, but they are all available to serve.
Right. So does this happen? Is this after 509 when the establishment of the Res Publica then? That's my point. That's my point.
Well, this is where it gets interesting.
That's one of the big, the big
that's
difficulties.
Your traditional. But first century historians want to tell you that it's all happening in terms of the kings come to an end, the republic starts, etc. If you want to look at it in terms of what I've been looking at recently is the topography of Rome, and actually the story of Rome, it really breathes out of what is actually Rome constitute. And of course, you get these early references to Rome of the Palatine Hill developing into Rome Quadrata, which is looking at, essentially four main centers congealing into Rome. But actually, that four actually can go back to a three. And of course, three is a number that comes up very much in the early Roman armies, right from the beginning, right through into the manipular stages as well. That three also comes through in terms of, there's a reference to the tribunes, military tribunes early on, where the tribune comes in. Of course, there is, if you go to the literary sources, they're talking about, you get consoles develop, and then you need consoles having support. So therefore the tribunes get it invented after that. But actually there's an argument that the tribunes might be coming before that, and actually may go back to the fact that there was 3 tribes originally in terms of makeup of Rome, which is mentioned by some of our sources. The names are spurious in terms of where they come from, and some people try to link it to a Latin, an Etruscan, and a Samnite element to the city. But in some way, perhaps that those tribunes go back to leading the 3 elements of the army in those early days, and then subsequently that sort of feeds through as the army sort of develops from that clan-based or ethnic grouping, depending on which argument you take, as it moves into a manipular army later on, but still preserving the 3s as such.
I think the other problem is a lot of the we talk about the Marian reforms, which are now like, well, it's not Marius. Marius doesn't do the Marian reforms. It's not 109 BC. You go back and you go, well, it's the Camillan reforms, 340 BC. You're like, well, no, it's not. It's not the Camillan reforms. Did he even, and then you go back through all of the periods in Roman history, and the normal history is it happens at this date. All of those reforms occur here.
The Servian reforms.
Yeah. And so what you've got actually is, no, these are all probably, gradual processes, which for some reason, at some point, some one individual has been given responsibility for them. I mean, we talk about the Manipular Legion, but in fact, the word cohort is used from the beginnings of Roman Republican history. Like, hang on, why are you using the word cohort? Well, group. And that's one of the other problems we have, is that we use these terminologies as if they may have specific meanings, when in fact they can have a general meaning. Homer uses the word phalanx, but what's a phalanx for Homer as opposed to a phalanx for Alexander, as opposed to a phalanx for Pericles? So similarly, what's a cohort across the periods of Roman history? And so that idea of like, this is what happens, and as you say, in history books, you get a very simplified version. So we talk about 2 consuls, and you're like, well, it's 2 magistrates. And so for the first 12 years of the Republic, we don't know if it's consuls, and it could be tribunes, because it later becomes tribunes.
You also you can throw in dictator there as well, because dictator appears in 506, and of course that's not the dictator that we know. Dictator is at that point a leader of an infantry unit.
So all of those sorts of finite, this is what it means, are like, well, actually, but you can't write much like a podcast, you can't do no. Actually, no.
Maybe.
So, yeah, exactly right. Maybe, perhaps, yeah, in my opinion. Yeah.
While you've been talking, I've just been reading Polybius 620, right, for example. I'm looking at the Greek and I'm looking at the English. And what it appears to me is that they have 4 legions, and they first of all, the tribunes are elected, because the consuls basically are really the people responsible for the running of the state, but also leading the army. And then they basically create the 4 legions all in tandem, and all the grades are in there. And your point about the 3s is interesting, because what it says here, the military tribunes at Rome, after administering the oath to their men and giving out the day and place in which they are to appear without arms for the present, dismiss them. When they arrive on the appointed day, they first select the youngest and poorest to form the velites, the next term to the hastati, while those who are in the prime of their life they select as principes, the oldest as triarii. So what that suggests is that they've chosen who's going to be showing up, and then they assign the roles for those people on a separate day. It's quite a fascinating process.
Well, it's wealth-based, so you can't be chosen as a triari if you're poor. So, you're cutting down who you based. You can't be chosen as a triari if you're young. You can't be chosen as a hastati if you're old. So in a way, the categorization is just a narrowing down of who's there. But it's also, the weird thing is it's 4. No, it's 6, because we have the Akensi, who we don't understand, and we have the Rorari, who we don't understand. And they all end up getting all their velites. Well, no, they're definitely not velites. They're separate, because they stand behind the standard. What do you mean behind the standard?
It's also interesting in terms of who else is there apart from you're all talking about these making up the Manipular Legion, or whatever you want to call it, army. But then, of course, you then start digging into the archaeology, and all these other types of weapons are there in the background being used. You've got the references to, of course, how many cavalry are there. You start with the idea of maybe there are 300 Celerites formed by Romulus, that gets doubled to 600. Maybe that gets tripled to 1800 at some point. We're not really sure. But at the same time, in the archaeology, there is evidence for horse bows being used at this time. Where did they fit in? So it's very fuzzy about around the edges as to what else is going on in this army.
Just to clarify, we have now just decided we're going to just skip the whole, because we're not going to be able to finish this problem today. It'd be nice. We could all write a book together about how we end up from this clan-based. Oh, that's an idea. This clan-based army into the Polybian army of the early 3rd century, because we have to, we promised people we were going to talk about the triplex Achaeans, so we have to go there some point. So go ahead.
I think that the triplex Achaeans, however the transformation occurred from what I think was a phalanx, whether it was directly modeled on the Greek phalanx or something very similar to it, to the legion that we know of from the Polybius, is that there was something happened to the Romans that made them change how they formed up their army. And the triplex Achaeans is the line of the Hastati in the first line, the young men, in the middle, the Principes, and the Triari in the rear. In front
annoying
of them,
question number 1, Mark. Principes, why are they in the second line?
Right, precisely. I think that mainly is because the terminology and why are they called the first line the Hastati when they don't carry spears? But that is because terminology is very cloudy, and all these lines had a cloud of. If we just look at a 4,200 man legion, not including the 300 cavalrymen, 1,200 of them were velites. So when you have these 3 lines, you had some sort of built-in reserve when they're formed up. My belief is that something happened to the Roman army that made them think that they couldn't have everybody in one line because it would buckle and break under some sort of tremendous charge or something. They needed to be able to either have troops behind them to stop a puncture, or to be able to wheel around to face a threat from any other direction. So I think that the triplex Achaeans was a very excellent way of doing that. The subtracted reserve was literally built in. For my point of view, and I find this remarkable, is the whole concept of the quincunx formation, which is a neologism that the Romans wouldn't have recognized, but modern commentators use it to indicate that the 5, if you look at it, think of it as a 5 on a die, or like a chessboard. How did these maniples actually fight? Did they close up ranks when they actually moved into contact? So you have a maniple of 260 soldier centuries, and did they then close up ranks, or did they leave gaps in some way so that enemy warriors could flow around them? That's very difficult to say. I'm very reluctant to believe that the Romans would deliberately allow anybody to get inside the line and possibly flank them. But one of the things that I see with the checkerboard, why that would have been the quincunx, one of the benefits is that it would allowed a Roman commander the ability to redeploy his forces relatively quickly, minimum of fuss, because the movement of these various units could then, they could move to the side either way. They could retire through whatever gaps remained. The same thing also, we shouldn't forget the 1,200 velites. They were, that's a lot of men to leave in the skirmishing formation. So they had to be allowed to retire as well. And they would form up once they had retired behind the Triarii. So I think that if you look at this whole formation from how the Romans would see it, is that it's sort of like I don't want to call it a meat grinder, but each time they would be presenting to an enemy like rows of shark teeth of relatively fresh soldiers who had not been directly in the zone of danger. So therefore they're not exhausted, they're not terrified. And the men who had already been fighting could be withdrawn and then given a rest possibly to fed back into the battle. The Romans had a phrase, it came down to the Triari. You'll probably have seen it in various formulations. The idea is that the battle has come down to the last throw of the dice, I guess. Interestingly enough, not only were the Triarii the oldest, most experienced men, they were armed much like hoplites were. So we may be seeing in this transition some sort of, whatever this period was, the transition from the phalanx and the spear-armed men to the newer style sword and shield men that is typically thought of as the classic Roman legionary.
But that's a nice, neat formation in terms of, saying that. But just to sort of throw a spanner in the works in terms of looking at, you mentioned the famous quote, it comes down to the Triarii. On the other hand, that sort of implies that it doesn't always come down to them, that you're not always deploying all of your ranks in a battle. At the same time, if we're talking about
the reserve is not involved.
But at the same time, in that case, is that not a wasted resource? Should that not be something that's rotated? I mean, at the same time, we talk about like the cani. One of the ideas of cani is that the defeat is caused by the lack of deploying the manipules with enough space between them that they cannot function properly and actually maneuver. But then coming back to what Murray said earlier, we've got that later term, cohort, which actually predates all of this, going back to 446, in which that's the first time it's used to refer to a Manipular army. But on the other hand, before that, it's being used to refer to auxiliary units, which are operating separately to the Manipular army. And then it's applied to the Manipular army when you break away 3 maniples at a time from the main army to operate as an independent unit. So that in itself implies that there's a lot more going on in the functioning of a Manipular army and the tactics that are being used than just the traditional checkerboard formation that we've all grown to love.
It's really interesting if you think about it. I mean, we tend to have the idea that an ancient army deploys mostly all on one line. There's very few cases where people obviously keep a reserve. And then once maybe the general gives instructions before the battle starts, but sort of as soon as the stoplight is green, it just go, and then it has to work or not. And often the general is in some position himself where he's just not even able to influence the battle because he's fighting, leading his own unit, or in the front line of the phalanx, or charging like a maniac in the case of a Hellenistic general. I mean, as Lindsay quoted, there's obviously an idea that you select people to be in a certain rank or depth, a certain position in your army based on their ability to pay for equipment and their experience and their physical endurance, where you put the youngest and maybe the least experienced guys up front. Then you have sort of your solid core of the guys who've seen it before and have to really do it. And then there's some old experienced hands who will stop people from running away and or provide your last reserve if you have to. And that would require, if it really works as a Queen thinks, either that all your the commanders of each maniple have the ability to know when they have to do something and have the authority to do so, or that there's some kind of much more complicated command system than anywhere else in the ancient world that coordinates when these things happen.
Well, to that point, I guess, but I mean, this is why it's interesting going back to he keeps going back to the military tribunes, right? So these are crucial people, it seems to be, in all of this. And they're, what are they? They're sort of aristocrats themselves. I mean, they're not poor people themselves, but they're given a position of leadership, which is tactical. I mean, they're not going to be hiding in a sort of tent looking out over the landscape. They're going to be in the lines. So I think they have a very important role in all this.
The other thing about the neat picture that Livy and even Polybius give us, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, is that it's a literary neat picture, because war is messy, but that you can't make literature out of war is messy. So it's got to have this lovely, this is what it should look like. And the problem, of course, when we bring up every individual battle, none of them look like that. So it's this literary ideal, which has come from somewhere, and maybe it's a theoretical, this is what should happen, and Polybius, when you start to focus on the recruitment phase, well, that's the only time it works. When we say, you guys, you're that, excellent, and then reality happens, people don't turn up on time, so-and-so got such and such to stand in for him, we don't have enough of them, you guys don't have the right equipment, oh God, it's all a mess. And so I think the literary picture is, oh, this is what it looks like, but the reality probably is, it never looked like that. That was the theory, and the reality, completely different.
So I would question that. I think that's a very broad brush statement. I think the fact that they achieved so much in the 2 centuries when this thing was around suggested it worked very efficiently, it worked very well. I mean, the Romans were a class-based society. Every man knew his place socially, and I'm going to say by inference, militarily. And it was harsh discipline. If you do not follow orders, the centurion will go around, or the operator will go around and bash you with a vine stick. There are punishments. So that there is military law, which is separate than civil law, and it's harsh. Discipline is harsh.
You mentioned the centurions there, though, and that possibly then goes back to what we've mentioned already in terms of the clan-based army, and those centurions are possibly going back to family units in that clan-based army, if we take it that far. So effectively, when you're talking about military discipline and order, etc., actually, there's probably a lot more in there in terms of social, connections and linkages, and something more akin to the PALS battalions in the World Wars, rather than necessarily saying it's all down to the guys being appointed as such. And the appointment of the tribunes is a late addition, a late evolution of how the tribunes are appointed in some way as such.
I'm not denying that they achieved remarkable things. I'm just questioning whether it was always as neat as we're told. Because when you read the battle accounts, it very quickly breaks down from, okay, so you've got the Hastati and the Principes, the Velites retire. When you actually read the battle accounts of what happens, sometimes you'll get one of those phases working well, and then that disappears. And the rest of it is, when you look at the Battle of Cannae, you're not getting, oh, now we send in the Principes, now we send in the Triari. Oh, we're surrounded and massacred. What happened there? You don't get that image when it goes wrong. And when it goes right, it's like, we were victorious. You're like, wow, how...
Well, what's interesting, though, on that subject is also what we see in the accounts with Livy is the bickering between the two consuls, who, because of the way the political system works, they alternate. It's my day today, so you listen to what I got, and then the very next day. So Hannibal very cleverly exploits that weakness, which is they rotate between each other because they're fearful that one man will emerge as being the Rex. I think you mentioned that earlier.
Which also contradicts your point about, well, if everyone knows where they stand and what their role is in a class-based society, how can the difference between a single individual being in control as consul make that big a difference? And I think the interesting thing is that the knowing that so-and-so is a wolf and such is a dove, to use a modern term, you can lure a Paulus into battle, and you can cause a battle to occur on your terms when they're in control. But similarly, that's what Miltiades does. That's what the Greeks do at Marathon.
I'll accept it to a point, but what I would say is, for example, by the time it gets to the rank and file, and you see this in the imperial period, is that, for example, the legate, in this case the consul, will issue an order, for example, and it may prove to be completely incompetent. It's now down to the rank and file to do something. And so often you will find it's the centurion and the individual legionary soldiers that do what it takes to survive, and they will execute their mission. And I think that's part of the Roman military genius, is the fact that they have this resilience all the way through. And remarkably, to Mark's point, I mean, there is this clan piece, there is this family bit, because you're fighting with your neighbors, actually.
But it is also, I think there are examples where at least seems to work. Like Kinoskea is a famous example where, uncommitted units are taken off by a tribune because they are waiting for their turn and swung around the right, and they decide the battle. And I think Zama it's very obviously described how they're in those lines and are able to open up, make lines for the elephants, and even suggesting that the Carthaginians are copying the triplex Achius, or at least I think there's some interpretations that they're doing that, which suggests that that is a visible thing and it seems to be effective. So they're copying it, trying to imitate the plan.
And even to Lindsay's point about when do you see centurions showing initiative, and the kind of Skiffly and Pydna, you got that. Oh, I see a gap, I can exploit that, which is an interesting. They don't have to go up the command chain to get permission. They go, no, that's the thing I should do. And again, that community thing of like, you've got a centurion, he's commanding 80 or 100 men or 60 men or whichever one, and takes them with
different
him.
podcast.
So,
yeah.
Well, we nailed that one then.
I think
nailed
so.
it.
No,
nailed it. Nailed it to a flimsy fence. It's a made of paper fence.
Yeah, it's
but
pretty
I mean, it's that funny thing, isn't it? Because it had to exist. We know it existed, at least on paper, and therefore transforming that to, okay, in the field, this is how we think it works. And I think it's interesting how the armies that Rome's facing, so coming to, Pyrrhus of Epirus, whenever the phalanx, the Hellenistic phalanx maneuvers, it's not by subsection, it's by rank and file. And so when we think of the quincunx and when we think of the triple axes, we're talking about maniples or units moving, not files moving. And it's always struck me that the transference of the Hastartes, the Principes and Principes to Triari, is talked about in centuries or bigger units, not files of units. And in the other war, and especially in the Pyrrhic wars, they're meeting an enemy that transfers by rank and file. And why, therefore, can't the Roman legion transfer by rank and file? But no source tells us that that's how they transfer.
But there's also indications that Pyrrhus is making his phalanx more flexible by alternating with italic units. It's one of those cases where it's very obvious that there's much more going on than our sources
and we
are
haven't
telling
even begun
us.
to talk about the allies, the Sarki and all those wonderful.
Shall we save that for another podcast?
Yes.
In that case, thank you all and see you again soon.